Good morning, everyone. Hope everybody's having a great week. And now this week, what I'm going to be covering is a very important topic called compliance. And within the compliance category, we're going to be talking about contingencies and contingency removals. So, in jumping right in and moving forward, keep in mind rule number one. When it comes to contingencies and contingency releases, it is vitally important, whether you're on the buyer side or seller side, that you keep that client on schedule. A majority of that responsibility stands on the buyer side, given the inspections, given the loan process. But there are some contingencies on the buyers or on the seller side as well, such as disclosures, such as making sure that the HOA docs are being released if that's pertinent to the transaction, and that is all being taken care of up front so that it can be a smooth escrow processing as well as, more importantly, closing. So remember, keep your client, buyer and seller, on schedule and get those contingencies removed on time. It makes a much smoother transaction. The seller is feeling much better about the transaction, and the buyer is keeping them moving, keeping them in the game, and making sure that they're happy with the way everything is progressing. Make sure in your buyer's interview, and I'm talking on the buyer side right now, that you make sure that the buyer is with a lender, or that buyer is going to be connected to the lender, your lender, for this transaction and for the buying process. You want to make sure up front that even while you're showing properties and a property hasn't been found, that the buyer is pre-qualifying, getting all of their information into the lender so the lender can process it. So really at the point you're showing property and writing offers, it's just a matter of plugging in the address, the selling price, and the terms and conditions of the transaction, and the lender then can move forward and run from there. So again, keep in mind, in that buyer's interview right up front where you're finding out, what type of home are you looking for, single story, double story, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, what are your important features, that you make sure right along with all of the important features that you're getting that lender involved with the buyer and that the transaction is getting off to a good, fast start. Once you have a home in escrow, obviously the first wave is going to be the inspections, making sure you get all of your inspections through and in on a timely manner so that when the inspection time period is completed and ended, that you can release those contingencies. You need to identify up front and as close and as soon as possible what other, beyond the home inspection, what other contingencies and inspections are going to be needed, both to be made as far as the inspection itself and to release the contingency once those inspections are completed and the buyer as well as you have a chance to review it. So, when I'm talking about beyond the home inspections, I'm talking about mold inspections if pertinent, a roof inspection if that looks like it's going to be required. You even might want to get a soils inspection. Check the drainage, check anything that you see that you find that you might have a question about or think isn't exactly the way it should be, the way the drainage comes in on the property, on the slab of the house. Then you want to get a soils engineer in there to make sure that home is going to be safe. Now, these are all inspections are on the buyer's side. So if the buyer elects not to do some of these inspections, even though you might suggest it, that's fine. That's on them. But at least keep your eye open, and we're not experts. I'm not asking you to diagnose exactly what the problem is, but you should be able to know enough to diagnose that, hey, we need to get a mold inspector in here and get somebody who's licensed contractor, specializes in mold, to check this out to make sure we're clear. Same would be true with electricians, with plumbing. If you feel there's any electrical issues, any plumbing issues, again, get a contractor in there, a licensed contractor that specializes in that particular question, and get them in there and have them do the inspection. Get a certified clearance from a licensed contractor. You don't want to try to diagnose it yourself. Again, we're not licensed contractors, we're licensed real estate agents. And the other thing you want to do too, and again, there's a lot of questions come up about this on how should I handle it. Permits. If you are walking a home and you're not quite sure this add-on is to code and you question whether or not there is a permit on that particular construction part of the home, then you need to send, not you, but you need to send the client, the buyer, into the city to get a full explanation as to whether or not that add-on, that piece of construction is permitted or not. Again, I don't want you doing it because your interpretation may or may not be correct. And if it's not correct and the buyer goes with it and finds out later there's an issue or a problem, then guess who? That falls back on your shoulders. That falls back on your misrepresenting. You don't want that. So again, if you have a question about it, raise that question to the buyer and then have the buyer go down to the city to make sure that particular home, that particular construction piece has been permitted. Now you can go down to the city with them, but again, don't interpret anything. Make sure the buyer gets the interpretation directly from the city and their compliance area of the city building permits. Keep in mind one thing when it comes to contingency releases, and this is more on the seller side. If the seller has really delayed in getting information out to the buyer, two things are going on here. One, if there's the buyer doesn't have to release all their contingencies if the seller hasn't provided the needed information for them to make a sound decision on whether to move forward with the purchase or not. A big example of that would be HOA documents. If the HOA documents have not been ordered on time up front and there's a delay in getting them because of the processing time with the HOA, then by the time the buyer has a right to inspect those and approve those. So if the buyer has not released their contingencies due to the fact they have not reviewed the HOA documents, then they have a right not to release it because the seller hasn't performed. Keep in mind one important factor here, that even if the buyer has released all of their contingencies, if they have not reviewed those HOA docs because they have not been provided to the buyer, they have a right to review those documents. If there's a reason in those documents the buyer chooses not to move forward and decides to cancel the escrow, they have a right to do that. And they also have a right to get their deposit back. So just because in a case where a buyer may have released all their contingencies because they're in a rush, if a fact comes up, HOA fact comes up, and they realize that after they've released their contingencies, then they have a right to cancel. Same is true with material facts. Again, the seller is required to release all material facts known to them to the buyer. If a material fact surfaces after the buyer has released all their contingencies, again, the buyer has the right to investigate that material fact and do an inspection if need be, and then come to the conclusion on whether or not to move forward with the escrow or to renegotiate the escrow. If the buyer decides to cancel the escrow, then again, they have a right to do that because material fact was given to them after they released their contingencies. So again, if you're on the selling side, make sure in your seller's interview, when you take the listing, the seller understands timely release of all material fact type information is handled up front, not delayed, not pushed back to the end of as we get to closer to the close of escrow, and in particular, not after it's been the contingencies have all been released by the buyer. Again, the seller's asking for trouble, could get delays in escrow, and you could end up with a last-minute cancellation, which the seller is going to say, well, I want the buyer's deposit. It's not going to happen.